Before the forum, I returned to the period when, upon having met Einstein at the lake and exchanged letters with him, the contact seemed to be torn again. Yet apparently, my bearing intrigued him. One evening, later in the fall 1952, I received a visit from a chemist, Dr. Plungian, accompanied by his wife, Gina, a sculptor. Gina was a friend of Einstein's daughter, Margot, who was also a sculptor. Plungians had heard from Einstein that I was living in Princeton. Gina, interested in what she had read about my work or was told by Einstein, and generally interested in writers and artists, was pleasantly surprised to find that my wife was also a sculptor. Dr. Plungian came to invite me to deliver a lecture before the Society for the Advancement of Science of Summit, New Jersey. This is the site of Bell Laboratories, one of the largest scientific laboratories in the world. The members of the Science Society there were, for the most part, scientists working for Bell. I accepted the invitation. I addressed a large audience at Summit. The lecture took place in February 1953. The chairman of the society, Dr. Joseph Baker, met me in the hall, and before I entered the large auditorium, worriedly inquired whether I would be able to restrain myself if some in the audience would become abusive. I assured him that he had nothing to worry about. In my lecture, I spoke mainly on the geological problems that are related to the theory of worlds in collision. The question period went off without a disturbance. At tea in the gallery, the discussion went on for another hour, and I realized the great appeal that geological problems of sea depths, of mountain building, and of ice ages have to the minds of many. As I took leave of him, the chairman announced, "Dr. Velikovsky has acquired a new follower in me." On another occasion, I was asked to meet a group of scholars and scientists at the home of the Plungians, and Dr. Shockley, the co-discoverer of the transistor and future Nobel Prize winner, led the discussion. We had a little mathematical skirmish in which I happened to be right, and he generously and immediately admitted it. About that time, Margot Einstein had known Elisheva since the 1940s, began to come to our home. Margot and Elisheva met in 1941 at Columbia University, where they both studied sculpture under Oronzo Merdarelli. Once Margot arranged for Elisheva to come to Princeton to play quartets with Einstein. Elisheva is a professional violinist and used to give many concerts before we came to the United States. And so in April of 1944, Elisheva came to Princeton, arranged for a violinist and a cellist to join her, and played with Einstein 3-string quartets of Mozart. At one of her visits, Margot told us in great detail of her experience in Holland during the Hitler regime, and mostly her stories were about animals, lambs, and birds, with whom she related better than with human beings in this evil world. It seems she wished to be well thought of by us. Occasionally she came with Miss Helen Dukas, Einstein's secretary. Miss Dukas had then been with Einstein for almost 25 years. She entered the service with him several years after I knew him in Berlin. After the death of his second wife, she took care of his correspondence and of his household. Elisheva and her musical colleagues would have chamber music at our home, and a small company of intellectuals would gather at these occasions. There were animated discussions. Miss Dukas and Margot were present a few times and enjoyed these evenings. The Graduate College of Proctor Hall lies separate from Princeton University campus. Its tower is seen from a distance, rising above the fields and golf courses by any car traveling on U.S. Route 1, and is the first visible landmark identifying the university town, hidden verdure. The common room, with its ornately paneled walls and leather easy chairs, is reached through a gateway and a quadrangle. In the fall of 1953, I was invited by the graduate students of Princeton University to address their forum. The student who invited me, as I recently found out, was George Field, 10 years later a scientist of achievement, and subsequently director of Harvard College Observatory, a post once occupied by Harlow Shapley. I was glad to have this occasion, as the theme of the lecture I selected, Worlds in Collision, in the light of recent findings in astronomy, geology, and archaeology. The lecture took place on the evening of October 14th. The common room was filled, and many stood around the walls and in the doorways. In the front row sat Graduate College Dean Sir H. Taylor and other dignitaries. Among those who remained standing for about 2 hours for the address and discussion were, as I hardly noticed, Margot Einstein, Helen Dukas, and Gina Plungian. Before the lecture started, my wife overheard one of those in the audience, a graduate student or instructor, as he assured his neighbor that it would be fun to listen to a crackpot. But as soon as I began, the audience followed my delivery with great attention. I offered nonconformist views, but there was nothing in them to confirm the expectation of a circus performance. I spoke for over an hour. A question and answer period followed. A few days later, a young friend, a 24-year-old assistant professor of aerodynamics, Ronald Probstein, told me how a scholar in the audience with a pipe in his mouth looked on with sarcastic triumph when the question period started, and changed his expression with every answer I gave. Question and answer periods, then and since then, have been my forte. The audience apparently discounts the knowledge that a lecturer offers in his delivery, since it could be carefully prepared, but is surprised to observe that a lecturer has the information needed to answer and rebut questions from the floor. I answered without difficulty the queries of all who came up from whatever department. There was one inimical graduate student in geology who loudly inquired, "Whom did you read on Rancho La Brea?" and he suggested that this deposit contradicts my assertions. I answered, "In my lecture I have not discussed Rancho La Brea, but I read Merriman's monograph, and I worked with Merriman's son." Said the student, "Merriman was the original investigator of that deposit at a time when it was on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Now it faces the Miracle Mile, an elegant shopping avenue. Actually, the asphalt beds of La Brea offer great difficulties for the uniformitarian theory of evolution. Human bones were found under a skeleton of an extinct vulture. A multitude of bones, smashed and broken, were found there, not in good order or shape, despite what the student had asserted in his question. Yet, the student announced, 'Catastrophes are your brain, children,' and thus had the last word. I did not answer. The audience applauded me warmly, and the student approached me to offer his apologies for his rudeness. In the course of the lecture, I made 2 statements as to the future findings I expected. After having reported on the manifold confirmations that had accumulated in the 3.5 years since the publication of Worlds in Collision, I thought it proper to conclude with 1 or 2 new predictions. For some time I had in my notes suggestions for tests to be made. I put it this way. In Jupiter and its moons we have a system not unlike the solar family. The planet is cold, yet its gases are in motion. It appears probable to me that it sends out radio noises, as do the sun and stars. I suggest that this be investigated. It is generally thought that the magnetic field of the Earth does not reach sensitively to the moon, but there is a way to find out whether it does or it does not. The moon makes daily rocking movements, librations of latitude, some of which are explained by no theory. I suggest investigating whether these unaccompanied librations are synchronized with the daily revolutions of the magnetic poles of the Earth around its geographical poles. Actually, both tests suggested were derived from one and the same concept, that the celestial sphere is not electrically and magnetically sterile. After the lecture, one of the graduate students who surrounded me told me about certain folkloristic material of the Indians that would support my views. I observed that he did not come forward to say this during the question period. As I walked to my car, I chanced to meet in the dark 3 ladies who had come from Einstein's house to my lecture: his daughter, Margot, his secretary, Helen Dugas, and their third friend, Gina Plungian. Later, Gina told me that when she had called to take Margot to the lecture and Miss Dugas joined them, Einstein said that he was eager to go too, but was conscious of the interest that would be centered on himself to the detriment of the proceedings. He added, however, that he expected to receive 3 reports from the 3 ladies, and he did. Gina Plungian later said that the dinner hour at Einstein's the day after the forum was spent discussing my lecture, and Einstein expressed sympathy for my position, that of a lone thinker defending his ideas. The Princetonian and the undergraduate students' paper at Princeton printed 2 articles about the lecture. In the first, it described how, with sheaths of documented evidence, Velikovsky quoted a myriad of scientists in these fields whose recent work, he said, made his theory more conclusive. In the second article, it said, after his lecture last night, he impressed all who attended by his well-reasoned and well-documented answers to questions posed by experts in physics, geology, and other sciences. In the next few weeks, I put the lecture into writing following the notes I had before me when addressing the forum. After it was typed, I gave a copy to Lloyd Motz, astronomer at Columbia University. Since the beginning of 1950, I had met with him on a number of occasions in his room on the upper floor of the Michael Pupin Physics Building. The subject we discussed were always the same: my insistence that the solar system, and by implication the universe, is not electrically and magnetically sterile. Since those memorable days at the end of 1949 and the beginning of 1950, I would, at intervals of 5 or 6 months, again and again return to Motz, trying to prove to him by enumerating a series of physical facts, some of them discovered since our previous meeting, that the accepted celestial mechanics could not be right in excluding electricity and magnetism from the participation in the movement of the celestial clock. The arguments must have been much the same as those that I used in my letters to Einstein in August and September of 1952. Motz would patiently listen and remain adamant. I would describe the motion of the cometary tails and insist that the accepted explanation of this phenomenon as being due to the pressure of light was inadequate. I was trying to evince from Professor Motz the concession that this was a decidedly insufficient explanation that could not account for the observation of a large comet sweeping with its tail hundreds of millions of miles of space in matter of a few hours, when going around the sun at perihelion. Yet he would still try to explain it by the pressure of light. The sentence concerning the radio noises of Jupiter startled him, and we discussed it. I asked for a meeting with Professor V. Bergman, a physicist who was possibly closest to Einstein of all scientists in Princeton. I remember the evening I visited him in his room in Fine Hall on campus. I discussed the question of electromagnetism in the solar system. Instead of slowly preparing the issue in his mind, I showered him with facts and details that indicated the inadequacy of purely mechanical explanations. I assumed that he must have been left with the impression that I was a man stubbornly questioning fundamentals which were beyond questioning. However, had he been present at my lecture in the graduate college, he would not think me without some knowledge, or a deficiency in logic. At that, my first meeting with him, Bargman, was a patient listener, possibly believing me to be irreparably lost to a fallacious view of things celestial, or perhaps recognizing some sound argument in what I said. I left him with the typed text of my address before the form, with its claims of radio noises coming from Jupiter, and a magnetosphere surrounding the Earth reaching to the Moon. Though he intended to return it to me after he had read it, it so happened that he misplaced it and only found it over 3 years later, all of which was fortunate. And thinking of such incidents, I could not help feeling that Providence was taking part in these matters. For in the meantime, in the spring of 1955, radio noises from Jupiter were discovered, as I predicted in my lecture of 1953. I'd like to ask those who think it's ridiculous for a planetary body, or a moon, if you will, to be born from another body, such as a gas giant or a brown dwarf, when, at the latest count that I know of, Jupiter has 67 moons and counting. And I bet they're going to find more than that before they're done. How else is Jupiter getting them? What would they say, by capture? I don't know. A couple of videos to give you a heads up on. There's a really good one by Troy McLaughlin called The Ganymede Hypothesis. Great video. It needs more attention. And this little jewel I found here. I know on my universal sandbox that Jupiter has about 200 moons, so that may have been updated. But for one reason or another, they don't seem too eager to tell us.
And through pictures from walls. According to this report, in October 2014, ADF doctor scientists ordered a full-scale electromagnetic pulse, EMP, alert after they're observing a 228 million kilometer, 142 million mile, plasma/electrical discharge between the Sun and Mars, but that subsequent astrophotography evidence produced by Dr. Fritz Helmut Hemmerich, member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, strongly suggests was caused by comet sighting Spring C/2013 A1 and like comet 41P/Tuttle-Jacobini. Kresak has just done to Earth had suddenly fired upon the planet Mars. As to why comet sighting Spring C/2013 A1 fired on Mars in 2014 and comet 41P/Tuttle-Jacobini Kresak has slowed down and begun firing upon Earth, this report says, can only be explained by understanding the research of the Nobel Prize winner for physics Dr. Hans Alfvén, who was the Swedish plasma physicist that, in 1967, came to the then Soviet Union, where he instructed Russian scientists in the field of plasma cosmology that Western scientists classify as a non-standard cosmology, but whose central postulate is that the dynamics of ionized gases and plasmas play important, if not dominant, roles in the physics of the universe, and is most commonly known as the electric universe theory. Western scientists' hatred of Dr. Hans Alfvén, this report explains, was due to his use of philosophy, literally means love of wisdom, in researching the electric universe theory, and who had begun his initial research by basing it upon the findings of the American philosopher George Woodward Warder, who, in 1903, published his groundbreaking book Universe, a Vast Electric Organism, and wherein he astonishingly described the massive electrical space tornadoes occurring between our Earth and Sun, but that took Western scientists 105 years to confirm as being true, with NASA space physicist Dr. David Sebeck of the Goddard Space Flight Center, in 2008, stunningly having to admit, 10 years ago I was pretty sure they didn't exist, but now the evidence is incontrovertible. With Dr. Hans Alfvén's use of philosophy to explain his electric universe theory being proved by the West's own scientists to be grounded in fact and not fiction, this report continues. his further basing his research on the findings of Russian Jewish historian-philosopher Immanuel Velikovsky provide the only answer as to what these comets are actually doing by their firing on Earth, and as Velikovsky described many times as the Dead Sea region was the scene of an interplanetary electrical discharge when a powerful electrical spark leaped down from above or sprang up from the Earth. Craters with rills radiating from them could be caused by infall of asteroids. Granted that such a process also took place, I wish to stress that interplanetary discharges must have created a large number of such formations. Like on the Moon, enormous craters resulted from bubbling, but some formations, especially surrounded with rays, resulted, in my view, from interplanetary discharges. Through the ADF does admit that modern scientific research has absolutely no idea why a comet would slow down and begin firing electrical discharges into our planet. Dr. Hans Alvane's philosophy historical-based electric universe theory most certainly does, and that includes the largest impact crater ever discovered in Australia being described in its Aboriginal Indigenous peoples' legends as having been formed by giant lightning bolts coming from the sky and the American Grand Canyon. Likewise, said to have been created by electrical bolts from the sky, not eroded by the Colorado River as Western scientists claim. Most concerning to the ADF, though, this report concludes, is that since Comet 41P/Tuttle-Jacobina-Kresak began slowing down this past spring, an outbreak of mysterious sky booms began to be reported the world over, and that have now been joined during this past week with the night sky, also turning electric blue, and these sky booms causing the ground to shake, too, thus highly suggesting that whatever is occurring will, undoubtedly, get worse and has caused the American Christian fundamentalist Nibiru believer David Meade to announce he and his followers are going into hiding.